There is a specific kind of intelligence that the practice of martial arts develops in certain men across enough years of honest engagement with it, and the intelligence is not the kind that announces itself in the ways that most kinds of intelligence announce themselves. It does not produce eloquence necessarily, or theoretical sophistication, or the ability to construct arguments that impress people in rooms where arguments are the primary currency. What it produces is something more precise and more difficult to develop through any other path, which is the ability to read a body. To look at the way a man stands, and the way he breathes, and the way he distributes his weight across his feet, and the way his hands hang at the end of his arms, and to extract from all of those things, in the time it takes most people to form a first impression, an accurate assessment of what the man is capable of, and what he is not capable of, and how large the gap is between what he believes about himself and what the practice has actually built in him. Bruce Lee had that intelligence to a degree that the people who trained alongside him across the years of his development described as almost supernatural, not because it was beyond explanation, but because it operated so quickly and so completely and with such consistent accuracy that the people watching it function could not track the process that produced the output, only the output itself, which was a reading of another man's physical capability that was almost always exactly right. Snorts. He had developed it across 15 years of training that had begun when he was a teenager in Hong Kong and had continued without interruption through his years in Seattle and Oakland and Los Angeles, across thousands of hours of sparring and drilling, and the specific kind of experimentation that a genuinely curious mind brings to a physical discipline when the mind is curious enough to keep questioning the received wisdom of the tradition, rather than simply accepting it, because the tradition has been around long enough to have accumulated authority. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles in the mid-1960s and began teaching and training in the environment that the city's martial arts community provided, the reading had become as natural to him as breathing. He walked into rooms full of martial artists and within minutes had assembled an accurate picture of every person in the room, that their own teachers might not have been able to produce after years of working with them. It was one of the things that made him extraordinary. It was also, on one specific afternoon in the summer of 1967, the thing that was wrong. The afternoon in question happened at Bruce Lee's school in Los Angeles, a private training space he was using in that period to work with a small group of selected students and occasional guests from the martial arts community who had been invited to train alongside him and whose presence he had determined would be useful to his own development as well as theirs. The space was not large. A single main room with a padded floor and mirrors along one wall and a heavy bag in the corner, and the specific functional bareness of a training environment built by a man who understood that the equipment required for serious practice was less than most people believed, and that the presence of unnecessary equipment was a way of avoiding the thing that the equipment was supposed to support, which was the honest confrontation with what you could and could not do on any given day. Clear's throat. Bruce was 26 years old that summer. He had been developing what he was beginning to call Jeet Kune Do for 2 years, working through the process of stripping his practice down to what he had determined through extensive testing to be the functional core of combat capability, and discarding the elements that the traditions had carried forward out of habit or reverence, rather than out of demonstrated effectiveness. He was perhaps the most intellectually rigorous martial artist of his generation, approaching the practice with the combination of scientific skepticism and genuine physical courage that the process of honest inquiry requires, testing his ideas against sparring partners who were capable enough to reveal the ideas that did not work and committed enough to the practice to be honest about what the testing revealed. He was also, in the specific way that genuinely exceptional people in any discipline are occasionally wrong, capable of being wrong in ways that were proportional to the confidence that his exceptional accuracy in most things had built in him. The confidence was earned, the accuracy was real, and the afternoon that Chuck Norris walked into his training space in the summer of 1967 was one of the rare occasions when the combination of earned confidence and genuine accuracy produced a reading that was precisely, completely, and consequentially incorrect. Chuck Norris was 27 years old that summer. He had won the professional middleweight karate championship for the second consecutive time the previous year and was in the middle of the competitive run that would eventually produce 6 consecutive titles and the reputation that followed them. He was 5'10" and weighed 170 pounds, and moved with the specific economy of a man who has been training his body seriously since his early 20s, and has developed through that training the kind of physical efficiency that makes everything the body does look like less effort than it is, because the unnecessary elements have been removed from the movement, and what remains is only what the movement requires. He had been introduced to Bruce through a mutual contact in the Los Angeles martial arts community, a connection produced by the smallness of the serious practitioner world in that city, in that era, and he had accepted the invitation to come and train at Bruce's school with the straightforward openness of a man who believed that the most useful thing you could do with your time as a serious practitioner was spend it in rooms with other serious practitioners, regardless of which tradition they came from or what their particular approach to the practice looked like. Snorts. He arrived at the school in the mid-afternoon in plain training clothes without any of the context that his competition record might have provided to someone who did not already know it, which in a room full of people who were paying close attention to the bodies around them was not a variable that could be compensated for by reputation alone. He shook hands with the people in the room. He said hello, he found a space on the mat and began warming up with the methodical self-sufficiency of a man who does not require external structure to prepare his body for physical work. Bruce watched him warm up. He watched him the way he watched everyone who came into his training space, which was with the complete, rapid attention of a man assembling an assessment. He watched the way Chuck moved through the warm-up, the pace of it, the range of motion, the specific quality of the footwork, and the way the weight shifted across the feet during direction changes, and the particular way the hands moved when they were moving without a specific technical purpose. He assembled the assessment in the time it took Chuck to complete the warm-up, and the assessment told him something specific about the man on the mat, which was that the man was a competent practitioner with real training behind him, but that the training was in a traditional system with the specific limitations that traditional systems carried, the limitations of a practice that had been developed inside a competitive framework, with rules and referees, and the managed conditions that competitive frameworks required, limitations that Bruce had been spending 2 years identifying and working around in his own development. Clear's throat. The assessment was delivered to him by the intelligence that 15 years of practice had built, the same intelligence that had been consistently accurate in its readings of the people who came through his training space, and he accepted it with the same confidence that consistent accuracy produces in the man whose instrument it is. He said something to the man standing next to him. The man was Dan Inosanto, who had been training with Bruce for 2 years, and who had developed through that training the specific capacity for reading the room that serious work under a serious teacher produces. He said it quietly, in the tone of a man sharing an observation with someone he trusted to receive it honestly. He said that the new man moved like a tournament fighter. He said it without contempt. He said it as a technical observation about the category of movement he was seeing, the category that the competitive environment produced and that carried the specific signature of a system calibrated for performance within rules, rather than for the broader requirement of genuine combat effectiveness. Inosanto heard the observation and looked at Chuck on the mat and made his own assessment and did not say anything, which was not because he agreed with the observation, but because he had been around Bruce long enough to understand that the most useful response to an observation was usually to wait and see what the training produced, rather than to argue the observation before the training had been given the chance to either confirm it or complicate it. Snorts. The session began informally, different people working different things in the specific productive chaos of a well-run private training session where everyone present is capable enough to self-direct, and the instructor's role is to observe and occasionally intervene rather than to manage the entire operation from the front of the room. Bruce moved through the space. He worked with different people briefly. He watched. He intervened when the watching revealed something that the intervention could address. He was in the process of observing a grappling exchange between 2 of his regular students when Chuck, who had been working on footwork drills in the open section of the mat, came to the end of a sequence and stopped and stood at rest with his hands at his sides and his weight, even on both feet, and waited in the patient, undemanding way of a man who is comfortable in his own company and does not require external direction to know what to do next. Clear's throat. Bruce crossed the mat toward him. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Chuck with the direct, assessing attention that he brought to every physical interaction, the attention that was simultaneously genuine engagement and ongoing data collection. He said that he had been watching the footwork. He said that it was clean. He said it in the tone of a man offering a genuine observation, and also in the tone of a man who has additional observations that the first observation is preamble to. He said that what he noticed was that the footwork was built for a specific range, the range that tournament karate operated in, and that the range had characteristics that made it effective inside its intended environment and less effective outside it. He said this as technical analysis rather than as criticism, because for Bruce, the two things were genuinely distinct. The technical analysis being the process of understanding what something was, and the criticism being the process of assigning value to it. And he was interested in the first process in a way that was prior to and independent of the second. Then he said that he would like to see how the footwork held up against a different approach to distance management. He said it the way he said most things about training, which was as an invitation so natural and so clearly genuine in its curiosity that it did not carry the weight of a challenge, even though what it was proposing was the kind of direct exchange that challenges are made of. Snorts, Chuck said that he was happy to find out. He said it simply. He moved to the center of the mat. Bruce moved with him. The other people in the training space, the 8 practitioners who had been working in various sections of the room, organized themselves into a loose perimeter around the cleared center in the instinctive way that serious practitioners organize themselves when something is about to happen in a training environment that deserves full attention. Dan Inosanto stood at the edge of the perimeter and watched with the specific quality of attention he brought to everything in this space, which was complete and honest and free of the prior commitment to any particular outcome that compromises the accuracy of attention in most observers. Bruce took his stance. The stance that he had developed across 15 years of training and 2 years of deliberate construction and reconstruction, the stance of Jeet Kune, which was the stance of a man who had looked at every available fighting system with genuine rigor and had extracted from each of them the elements he had determined through extensive testing to be the most functionally effective and had organized those elements into a coherent personal system that expressed itself in the way he stood and the way he breathed and the way he managed the space between himself and the man across from him. Lead hand forward. Weight distributed with the slight forward bias that facilitates explosive forward movement. Eyes on the center of mass rather than on the hands or the face. The place where the body's intentions announce themselves most honestly. The stance of a man who has thought more carefully about fighting than almost anyone alive in 1967. Clears throat. Chuck stood across from him without taking a stance. His hands were loose at his sides. His weight was even on both feet. His eyes were on Bruce with the open, patient quality of attention that he brought to the beginning of any genuine exchange, which was the attention of a man who had learned through 6 years of high-level competition that the most important thing at the start was to see what was actually in front of him rather than what his preparation had led him to expect would be in front of him. He did not bounce. He did not roll his neck. He did not make any of the preparatory movements that signal to a room that something significant is about to begin. He simply stood and waited and watched. Bruce initiated. He came forward with the explosive linear directness that was the signature of his offensive approach, the lead hand jab thrown from the forward stance with the full extension of his extraordinarily fast hands behind it. The jab was among the fastest single strikes that any of the people in that room had ever seen produced by a human body. The people who trained with him regularly had developed the specific adaptation that regular exposure to extraordinary speed produces, which is a recalibrated expectation of what fast looks like that made ordinary fast look slow by comparison. The jab came forward in the straight, clean, devastating line that 15 years of development had refined it into. Snorts. Chuck's head was not there. He had moved it offline in the quarter second that existed between Bruce's decision to throw and the jab's arrival at the place where the decision had aimed it. A movement so small and so precisely timed that 3 of the 8 people watching from the perimeter did not register it as a defensive action until they processed the fact that the jab had not connected. In the same quarter second, Chuck's lead foot had moved forward and to the outside of Bruce's lead foot, and his right hand had come up in a short hooking arc toward the left side of Bruce's jaw. He pulled it. He pulled it with the complete and specific control of a man who has thrown this punch 10,000 times in competition and training and knows exactly where it is at every point in its arc and can stop it at any point that intention selects. The hook stopped 2 inches from Bruce's jaw and held there for the fraction of a second required for its arrival to be registered by the man whose jaw it had arrived beside and by the 8 people watching from the perimeter. 8 seconds from Bruce's jab to Chuck's hook stopping 2 inches from his jaw. 8 seconds had elapsed from the moment Bruce initiated to the moment the hook held in the air beside his face. 8 seconds is a duration so short that it resists meaningful description in ordinary terms. It is shorter than the time it takes to read the sentence describing it. It is shorter than the time most people require to process what they are seeing when they are seeing something that their prior experience has not prepared them to see. 8 seconds in a training room in Los Angeles in the summer of 1967, witnessed by 8 practitioners who understood exactly what they were watching, was a different kind of 8 seconds than the 8 seconds that passed in the rest of the world at that moment. It was 8 seconds that contained a complete education. It was 8 seconds that corrected an assessment that 15 years of accurate reading had produced and that had been wrong in the specific and important way that assessments are wrong when the instrument that produces them is excellent and the data it was given was insufficient. Snorts. Bruce stood in the center of the mat with the hook 2 inches from his jaw and held there. His face was carrying an expression that Dan Inosanto, who had been watching Bruce's face in training contexts for 2 years and who knew its vocabulary better than most people who were not Bruce Lee knew it, said later was an expression he had seen only a handful of times across all of those hours. It was not the expression of a man who had been beaten. It was the expression of a man whose instrument had just returned a reading that contradicted the reading it had given him 45 minutes earlier, when he watched Chuck warm up, and who was in the process of doing what a genuinely rigorous mind does when it receives contradictory data, which is to discard the reading that the new data has invalidated and begin constructing a more accurate one. The expression lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Chuck lowered his hand. He stepped back 2 paces. He stood with his hands at his sides. The 8 people at the perimeter did not make a sound. Clears throat. Bruce looked at Chuck for a long moment. The moment had the specific quality of a pause that is doing significant internal work, rather than simply marking the transition between one thing and the next. Then something happened in his face that Inosanto would describe in subsequent years as one of the most remarkable things he had witnessed in the training environment, which was the arrival of a genuine smile. Not the performed warmth of a man managing a social situation. Not the tight, controlled expression that men sometimes produce when they are working to appear gracious about something they are not gracious about. A real smile, the kind that reaches the parts of the face that social performance cannot reliably access, produced by a man who has just had an experience he was not expecting and who finds the unexpectedness of it genuinely, unreservedly delightful. He said one thing. He said it in the direct, uncomplicated tone of a man stating a fact that the previous 8 seconds had established beyond any available argument. He said that he had been wrong about the footwork. Snorts. He said it without qualification and without the diplomatic surrounding that men usually build around an admission of that kind to soften its edges. He said it as a simple declarative statement about the relationship between his prior assessment and the data that had just been provided to revise it. Then he said something else. He said that what Chuck had just done with the distance was something he had not seen done at that speed against his jab by anyone he had worked with in 2 years of development, and that the combination of the head movement and the foot placement and the timing of the counter was a solution to the problem of the forward stance that he had not previously encountered in the form it had just taken. He said this with the specific excitement of a man who has just been given a piece of information that is genuinely useful to the project he has been working on, which for Bruce in the summer of 1967 was the project of understanding what worked and why it worked, and how to incorporate what worked into a system that was as comprehensive and as honest as 2 years of rigorous development had been able to make it. Lear's throat. Chuck said that the timing was the thing. He said that the jab telegraphed in the shoulder a fraction of a second before the shoulder produced it, and that the fraction of a second was the available window, and that the window was small enough that it required years of competition to develop the capacity to use it consistently. He said this in the plain, direct language of a man sharing technical information he had spent years accumulating and who had no interest in presenting it as more mysterious than it was. Bruce listened with the complete attention of a man receiving information that he intends to use. He asked a question about the foot placement. Chuck answered it. Bruce asked another question about the timing of the weight transfer relative to the initiation of the counter. Chuck answered that too. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, the 2 men standing in the center of the mat, while the 8 people at the perimeter listened and the Los Angeles afternoon light moved across the floor of the training space. In the slow, flat way that afternoon light moves across the floors of training spaces, everywhere, indifferent to what is being discovered beneath it. What developed in the training room that afternoon and across the sessions that followed it over the next several years was one of the most genuinely productive relationships in the history of American martial arts. It was productive in the specific way that relationships between genuinely serious practitioners from different traditions are productive when both men are honest enough to let the other man's knowledge challenge their own assumptions rather than defending their assumptions against the challenge. Bruce absorbed what Chuck showed him about distance management and the specific qualities of the Tang Soo Do kicking game, and the way that 6 years of high-level competition had developed in Chuck a reading of timing and commitment that the training environment could approximate but not fully replicate. Chuck absorbed what Bruce showed him about the philosophical framework of Jeet Kune Do and the specific process of honest inquiry that Bruce brought to every technical question and the willingness to discard anything that testing revealed to be less effective than the practice had assumed it to be. Snorts. Each man gave the other something that the other man's tradition had not provided, and neither man was defensive about receiving what the other had to give, which is the condition that makes this kind of exchange genuinely productive rather than merely interesting. Dan Inosanto said years later that what he had watched in the training room that afternoon was the specific moment when two of the most important martial artists of their generation had established between them the terms of a relationship that would shape both of their subsequent development in ways that neither of them could have fully anticipated when Chuck walked in from the Los Angeles afternoon in his plain training clothes and began warming up on the mat, without any of the context that his competition record might have provided. He said that the 8 seconds had been the foundation of the relationship in the specific way that honest physical exchanges between serious men are sometimes the foundation of genuine connections, because the 8 seconds had established between the two men the kind of mutual respect that is only available through direct physical encounter and that no amount of reputation or credential or second-hand account can substitute for. The reputation tells you what a man has done. The 8 seconds showed you what a man was. And what a man was in the specific environment of a training room in Los Angeles in the summer of 1967, with 8 serious practitioners watching from the perimeter, was the only information that was going to matter. Clear's throat. Bruce Lee died in July of 1973 at the age of 32. He died 6 years after the afternoon in the training room, 6 years into a relationship with Chuck that had continued across the intervening period in the form of the ongoing exchange between two men who had found in each other a genuine and productive challenge to their respective assumptions about what the practice required and what it could produce. He had incorporated what the 8 seconds and the 20-minute conversation that followed them had given him into the continuing development of Jeet Kune Do in the specific way that a genuinely rigorous mind incorporates genuinely useful information, which is completely and without the selective processing that defensiveness produces in minds that are protecting a prior commitment rather than pursuing an honest understanding. The development of his system across the 6 years between the afternoon and his death bore the marks of what he had learned from Chuck, in the way that serious development always bears the marks of the genuine challenges it has absorbed, not as foreign additions visible on the surface, but as integrated elements that have become indistinguishable from the whole. Snorts. Chuck spoke about Bruce across the decades after his death in the careful way that a man speaks about someone whose loss he has genuinely felt and whose presence in his life he understands to have been genuinely significant. He spoke about the quality of the mind and the quality of the curiosity and the specific combination of physical genius and intellectual rigor that made Bruce unlike anyone else he had encountered in the practice. He did not speak publicly about the specific afternoon in the training room, or about the 8 seconds, or about the assessment that the 8 seconds had corrected. He had a principle about encounters that were complete, which was that the encounter had said what it had to say while it was occurring, and that saying more about it afterward diminished rather than preserved what it contained. He kept the principle. He applied it to the afternoon in the training room, the same way he applied it to everything else. The principle held. What the 8 people who were in that training room that afternoon said about it, in the years and decades that followed, was consistent across the different accounts in the way that eyewitness accounts of genuinely significant events are sometimes consistent, which is in the essential detail that made the event what it was rather than something else. The essential detail was the smile, not the 8 seconds, which were extraordinary in their own right, and which said something specific and complete about the relationship between the two men's capabilities that the 8 people watching understood immediately and completely. The smile that came after the 8 seconds. The genuine, unreserved smile of a man who has just been given information that contradicts what he believed, and who finds the contradiction not threatening but delightful because the contradiction is more interesting than the prior belief, and because the man who delivered it is clearly worth knowing, and because the practice honestly pursued always produces more interesting questions than the answers it temporarily provides. That smile, in the specific training room in Los Angeles in the summer of 1967, was the thing that the 8 people remembered most clearly and most consistently across all the years of telling the story. Because the smile was the thing that told you what Bruce Lee actually was underneath everything else he was. It told you that the practice was the point, that the finding out was the point. That the man across from you who just showed you something you didn't know was not a threat to what you had built, but a gift to what you were still building. And that the correct response to the gift was the smile that genuine gratitude produces when the gratitude is real and the man receiving it is honest enough to show it.